Hiya. Because I have no ideas of my own, I thought I'd do a video about my top favourite books that have influenced me as a musician. Adam Neely has done a video, obviously. David Bruce is a composer, has a channel. He's also done a video himself, which is quite brilliant in that it contains absolutely no books about music, which I kind of like. But all of these that I'm going to show you today are music books. None of them are concerned with the Barry Harris method. I feel like I didn't learn about that out of a book. I learned about it from Barry in his workshops, which is a tremendous privilege. His teaching wasn't nearly so popular and well known about 10 years ago, which is when I first came across it. I suppose it makes me a kind of jazz hipster, but but anyway, you know, it's obviously much better known now, and the DVDs are great, and Alan Kingstone and Ronnie Ben-Hur have written great books about it for guitarists. So I'll just mention that, but none of these are really concerned with that. I just feel they're books that have shaped me as a musician. So my background is I started off really being kind of contemporary chord scaly kind of player. I didn't really know very much about anything before the 1960s. And yet, you know, I'd do jam sessions and then go, oh, what are all these chords doing? Why? I would look at a chart for something like rhythm changes and go, why is there a seventh chord in that position in the scale? I didn't understand anything about functional harmony. And the book that really helped me was this. I basically read it because I was interested in classical music, and I wanted to know how composers compose music, right? So I had to start reading classical music theory. This is part 2 of a 2-book series that's designed to introduce music theory to people taking the ABRSM, or Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, graded exams. We have 8 grades for every instrument you can think of, various different boards that grade them. Classical guitar, rock guitar, not jazz guitar unfortunately, but piano, French horn. I don't know if they do ophicleide or serpent, but you know, maybe they will in a few years, who knows. Anyway, so they do all these exams, and you have to, part 1 gets you up to grade 5, which is what you need to know to get onto the higher grades in an instrument. But this is the book you read if you're interested in taking grades 5 to 8. Basically, if you're a weirdo or a wannabe composer. I think I fell maybe into the second category in my mind, but probably in reality was in the first category. Anyway, it talks all about, you know, the basic building blocks of classical harmony and things like, you know, secondary dominants, leading tone diminished chords, augmented sixths, Neapolitan sixths, all of this stuff, modulations, all that kind of stuff. And that kind of went into my head and helped me understand how standards work, because standards are written really with functional harmony. As Barry Harris says, the harmony is classical. And those guys in Detroit, not just Barry, but also people like Paul Chambers, Kenny Burrell, so on and so forth, had a really strong foundation in classical music. Not that playing classical music helps you understand you know, classical music, because you don't necessarily understand theory, but they had a grounding in the sound of that music, and it's important to understand where all of that comes from. And this is a really good book for just, you know, I mean, people understand things in different ways, but for me, I still kind of think of this language, you know, like I think of the E-flat 7 chord out of nowhere, and it's an augmented sixth, for instance, you know, or all the things you are use as the Neapolitan sixth as a pun into the key of the mediant, you know, and stuff like that. I think classically in that way. And I think the people who composed those songs had classical backgrounds, like Richard Rodgers and Bronislaw Kappa and all these sorts of people. They all attended like Eastern European conservatories, you know, and they learned about classical music. So this is great. It also covers a little bit of the 20th century stuff, like Messiaen's modes of limited transposition, which I think are quite trendy with jazz guitarists these days, and 12-tone stuff, very basic 12-tone stuff, and things like that. It's very good. You know, obviously, if you want to really understand 20th century harmony, then there are other books that are more exhaustive. But for, like, you know, a short guide, which isn't that long, and yet covers an awful lot of ground, you know, everything from part writing to orchestration to harmony, it's pretty good. I mean, It's not a classic text, but I got a lot out of it. One book that is a classic text is this one, Fundamentals of Musical Composition by Arnold Schoenberg. I know you can read, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's a good name for a book. So this is one of several kind of seminal texts. Can I say that on YouTube? Yes, I can. Seminal texts that Schoenberg wrote. I'm choosing this one over kind of the better-known harmony Lehre or theory of harmony because this taught me how to write a melody, a musical composition, 16-bar period or whatever, or 8-bar or an 8-bar period or, sentence, whatever, and it kind of helped me understand the basic forms of melody before thinking about harmony. And that's what it's about. It's about taking little motifs, developing them into longer melodies, and eventually, if you get good enough at it, the idea is that you'll be able to sort of start to write in sonata form. So it's not about, what it absolutely isn't about is about Schoenberg's own music, 12-tone system. It's about his background, which was in German music, particularly like, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, that kind of thing. That's where Schoenberg was coming from. So, he's self-taught as well. So it's interesting that his kind of take on it, which is completely his own, like Barry Harris's, right, has suddenly become like the sort of bedrock, like classical composition students still study this book. So that's a great one. And I've taken a lot of the lessons from that and applied them in my own composition, the basic sort of how to do it and how to write a coherent musical sentence, hopefully. It might not be obvious from my music. Anyway, this is a good one. I just wanted to pick this one out because of the terrible things that Charles Wuorinen says about jazz in here. This is in 1962. I understand Charles actually ended up teaching at Berkeley or something. I think he's actually quite influential in jazz circles, which makes this more amusing. But basically, it's a diss of jazz. But what he says, I think, is so perceptive that it's actually been a really big influence on me, even though I, love jazz, obviously, and play it for a living. So the interviewer says, "What about jazz? Is it or isn't it?" I think that's the way people spoke back in the 1960s. Wuorinen answers, "Awful. Yes, it is. I find it very boring to listen to. I think the reason is that in jazz of almost any type, two irreconcilables are in conflict. The tonal-oriented vertical approach of I can't even speak. And who speaks like this anyway? Awful. Yes, it is. I find it very boring to listen to. I think the reason is that in jazz of almost any type, two irreconcilables are in conflict, the tonal-oriented vertical approach of recent Western music and the improvisatory instinct." That's hard to say, isn't it? "The trouble here is that vertical thought, chord changes and their more modern derivatives are inextricably part of a musical ambience which is goal-oriented. To use a bourgeois solecism. You are excused. The whole point of functional harmony and modes of musical thought derived from it is that it gets somewhere, usually to the home key." This is the key point, right? "In a certain specified period of time," right? That's what this stuff is about. Now, this, it seems to me, is absolutely contrary to the marvellous improvisatory spirit of real, spontaneously created music. The result of the tension in jazz between these two is an immobility that pretends to motion, which I find very irritating. I'd much rather hear Carnatic music, for there the pretensions of jazz are actualised." He goes on, "Furthermore, I resent the claim of some present-day jazz to be part of the serious progressive movement. It isn't," and so on. But anyway, now that's an interesting criticism, and kind of what he says is kind of why I like it. The clash between like the old school tonal functional harmony of the standards and then the structures that you create over the top of it, and that tension makes it interesting to me. And that's what bebop is to me. It's trying to be as free as possible over changes. And obviously Charlie Parker was, better, if not, well, definitely better, I think, than anybody before, and certainly as good as anybody since at doing that. You can also think of people like, Sonny Rollins and Jimmy Rainey and people like that. Modern reading text in 4/4. Every musician should own this. It's just pages and pages of this kind of stuff. Blech. Horrible. That'll do more for your reading than anything else. I mean, seriously, just get that book and just read a page of it a day. It'll sort you out. This is cool. I like this one. So, let's give you the... So Duncan Lamont is kind of a well-known. I hope you wouldn't mind me calling him an elder. Can I call him an elder? I hope Fody won't mind. On the London jazz scene, and I played with him a couple of times and played his charts and big bands. And he's just played with everybody, you know. He's just a great sax player, you know. He's one of the guys, and also known as a composer as well, like very much so. And in fact, I think probably he's even better known as a composer. But I love this book because it's kind of a hang. It's like just hanging out with a guy, and then talking about, you know, a few little strange things he's got about these funny scales that he's got, like these things, which, you know, I haven't really played around with, but they're interesting, you know. And he's talking about, you know, playing outside the changes and all this kind of stuff, and some, you know, but some really human advice as well. Things like, you know, if you're doing really well in your career and you've got loads of gigs and everything's going great, you know, don't go on about it to anybody else, because the person you're talking to might be really struggling and having a hard time. And then, you know, and things like that. And it's like a really good point. You know, it's very easy if you're enthused about stuff, you know, to just gush and go like, yeah, I'm doing this, this, and this, and this, and this. But, you know, sometimes people don't need to hear that. You know, and there's this little things like that. There's a great story about Ben Webster in here and Benny Goodman and all sorts of things. It's a cool book. I really like it. And I think I'll probably revisit it and look at some of the more crunchy musical stuff. But I just love the stories. This is one hell of a book. This is a bit of a cult classic, this one. But just look at the title. That's kind of all you need to know about it, right? Think about it. He's got funny names for all these Lego bricks that some people use, and so on and so forth. Actually, what I like most about this book, again, you know, is kind of like not the primary focus, but him talking about like the history of jazz and the fact that jazz doesn't exist. The jazz musician's art form does not exist in a copyrightable form. You can't copyright a solo. Isn't that weird? You know, and all this stuff. It's great. He's a really clever guy. He's not particularly well known, I don't think, these days as a jazz musician, but he's a real deep thinker and fantastically knowledgeable about the music. And one great bit that made a big impression on me is the way he debunks this whole idea that modern jazz is based around the upper extensions. You know, if we're talking about Charlie Parker and music onwards. Get it and read it. It's interesting. A similar book is Hearing the Changes by Jerry Coker. It's basically the same idea, but it has different names for everything, and it doesn't have any of the interesting rants. Okay, I do like a good rant, as you've probably noticed. Time Awareness by Peter Erskine, the drummer from Weather Report. Just really great at sort of giving you a basic understanding of what good time is and how to cultivate it. And the point he makes early on, which is really really good, is like about, you know, common traps where you might mess up the time a little bit. I'm going to have to read this again, actually. And it talks about the fact that, you know, when you sing a melody, making sure that the spaces are the right length and all this kind of stuff. Real fundamentals, like Old MacDonald Had a Farm, you know, is one of the tunes he uses as an example. Really, really deep, drilling down to the fundamentals. And of course, you know, it gets more complicated. You have all this crazy stuff in odd time later on, and, you know, Old MacDonald and Seven, which I'll have to try at some point. And all this kind of stuff. But the basic, you know, it's really about fundamentals. And I really dig that. Another couple of books. A Jazz Life by an author whose name I have a mental block about, so I'll try and put that up on the screen. That's really good. That's written by a guitarist, unlike any of these other books. But it's about Warne Marsh and the experience of studying and playing with him, and also the actual stuff that Warne Marsh was teaching. And I got an awful lot out of that. It's got some great stuff like the 2-octave scales, like 2-octave C major scale goes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, first octave, right? Fair enough. C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, like Lydian in the next, and then it goes up to a C sharp, and you can sit in the C sharp and a C major chord, you know, all this kind of stuff. And the importance of slow improvisation, like slowly improvising through a tune at like 60 beats a minute with just quavers. Just brilliant stuff, you know, really, really good. Warne Marsh is in my top 10 of like post-war jazz improvisers. He is one of the greatest. Forward Motion by Hal Galper, massively influential in my ideas about phrasing and swing and line construction. Very complementary to Barry Harris. It kind of, does that. It's like a mirror image of the same stuff, but looking at it from a different mirror image is a different angle, but you get the idea, right? You can do one thing and then the other and then look back and go, oh yeah, it's just great anyway. I definitely recommend that. And then these two books, which are a bit more new. I haven't really looked at these quite so much, but what I've taken them from already is really good. It's going back to the classical thing about the kind of training that composers actually received as children, like 17th century, Partimento and Partimenti even, and things like that. It's got a lot of stuff about... this first book, it talks a bit about patterns and rules, regole, and how you lead one bass note to the next, and good chord progressions to do that. It's all in figure bass, so you have to understand that system. But actually, figure bass is really logical, and then eventually more complex realizations that involve counterpoint and so on. Obviously, very closely related to figured bass, but really good book, really like that. And then this one, which is about the kind of modules that Mozart and Haydn, Scarlatti, Vivaldi, all those guys might have been either consciously or subconsciously using to construct their music. So it's kind of like classical composition with Lego bricks. Anyway, I'll try and list them all below. Some of them might be out of print, I don't know. I bought some of these books I bought 20 years ago, so the Schoenberg will obviously still be in print. But anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you find that useful and interesting.